So our distinguished panelists managed to distill for us carefully on careful indigenous data governance. And whilst they are settling in, I'll just like to take comments from our online audience. And I just want to acknowledge all of you for your presentations and also acknowledge from our online audience that the audience is actually acknowledging what you have done in acknowledging the indigenous communities in your opening of your presentations. Thank you for that. The first question is from Gabriela Pino Chacon. Gabriela says she wonders what the path was for the Sami people to become so empowered of their own knowledge. Any taker on that one? It's about the Sami people.
I think it was just decades and decades of feeling they were marginalized, and I think probably after 94 when we had a change in government and there was more recognition of the indigenous peoples and their cultures, and so that probably was part of the trigger. But I think if you go and look at the actual Sang Code, you'll see they acknowledge one of their particular leaders who was the driving person. I think it was David Craper, but I might have got the wrong name. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anthony. The next online question I want to pose, and the audience on the floor, may you please also, when you ask a question, just indicate your name and your affiliation. It will assist us. How do we ensure, this is from Jintali Yadav, how do we ensure that global open science frameworks don't repeat old patterns, especially indigenous data, to open communities or commodities? How do we ensure that global open science frameworks don't repeat old patterns with regards to indigenous data to open commodities? Is it too abstract? Jintali, your question seems too abstract. We'll move whilst they are pondering. Yes, Anthony?
Yeah, I shouldn't be answering this question because there was someone else who was talking about global open things, and I think they're probably a bit scared to answer. So, it's with everything. We're all victims of our governments and victims of rich companies and everything like that. And we really, as individuals, need to, make our voices heard. We need to try and defend our rights. And of course, it's very difficult to do that. Hopefully, one of you will now follow up with that with something much more useful.
Okay.
Here we go.
I'm going to say something from the perspective of institutions such as universities or research institutes that are working with indigenous communities, and a lot of the time there's no formal agreement between the institution and the indigenous groups that their researchers may be working with. And I think that a big step forward to protect the data that is being generated in those research partnerships would be if the institution took responsibility for creating a formal relationship with those indigenous groups, and then took responsibility for ensuring that data was being correctly curated and governed, and that the care principles were actually being implemented. Because individual researchers can't really take responsibility for that long term, but institutions can, because institutions last for a lot longer than individual research groups.
Thank you. The last question online is from Jintali Yadav. Jintali is very active online. We appreciate you. Are data citations reinforcing power imbalances while field scholars or communities remain invisible? Are data citations reinforcing power imbalances while field scholars or communities remain invisible? It's about data citations and the invisible communities. Again, Jintali is very deep in thought.
I don't want to answer all the questions.
Your wisdom and the
No,
Anthony.
yeah. No, it must be the jet lag why I talk so much. I think all these cowards must answer. I think the youngest man should answer. There we go.
I think so. And he doesn't use
There's a mic.
ChatGTP. It comes from the head.
Yes, there we go. I mean, short answer, yes, it absolutely can. Everything we do can reinforce existing norms and practices if we're not careful. There's no magic set of tools and approaches we can use that will fix existing problems, particularly things that are built on centuries of unequal and discriminative or extractive practices. So, yes, absolutely, if we're not careful, that will continue and perpetuate existing problems. And it's a question of how do we address that as a community.
Okay. Thank you. Can we have from the floor? Yes, thank you. At the back.
Hi, my name is Owen. I work with CSIRO. My question is for Ray and Bob. So can you speak about your experiences in cases where the boundaries of what counts as Indigenous data might be contested when you're dealing with government or research institutions, maybe with health data or in cases where it might be about data related to countries rather than First Nations people? How do you think about applying the MLW principles to negotiate or discuss the boundaries of what is in scope as Indigenous data?
Anthony, don't you have a microphone there?
No, I don't.
We need the... Yeah,
I got one.
okay.
Sorry, Owen, can you say that again?
Yeah, hi. My name is Owen Forbes. I work at CSIRO. My question's for Ray and Bobby. Let me read out my question again. So can you speak about your experience with cases where the boundaries of what counts as Indigenous data might be contested when you're dealing with government and research institutions? For example, in your experience in health research, or maybe in cases where data might relate to country rather than Indigenous people explicitly. How are those situations navigated with the MNW principles, and what does it look like in terms of discussing the boundaries of what is considered in scope for Indigenous data governance?
Yeah, it's pretty simple. We get this question a lot. So most people, particularly in health, I have to say, think that Indigenous data is the Indigenous status variable in the data set. So I'm here to tell you that that is just not the case. So you'll notice in our presentation we talked about the first thing we did with the community was talk to them about designing the structure. The next step is to ask them in terms of health what their priorities are and then map those against those data assets that we talked about. So it's not necessary. So the priority actually comes from the people about who should make the decisions around what they want to govern and make decisions. But yeah, I see it a lot that people define Indigenous data by the Indigenous status variable. It's just not the case. So it's what Indigenous people decide is important to them, because that's the true essence of self-determination. You make the decisions about what's important, and then you enact that through the governance mechanism to say, well, I want that data returned in what fashion and those sorts of things. So we get caught up on this quite a lot. And you'll note that one of the principles is around relevance. So this goes to this point. What is the relevant data for Indigenous people in the context in which you're working? The second one that's important there is the control. So we want to understand what data is relevant and important, the priorities, and then what governance decision-making mechanisms apply over that data. So I think the principles, they are real, principles are abstract concepts. You have to really work through what relevant means. You have to work through what control means within the context in which you're working. So I think that's what a lot of people are doing with their various principles, whether it's CARE, whether it's MNW, whether it's other principles like Te Manararanga in Aotearoa and other places. It's about how do you move from principles to action.
Thank you. One more question. We have 2 minutes left. This is disappointing. Thank you, sir. And yeah.
Hold up.
Okay, let's hold up for the online because we need to ensure the online colleagues can hear. Thank you.
Thank you. It's Stuart Coleman at the Open Data Institute from the UK. The point was made, sorry, I forget your name, the gentleman in the middle from New Zealand, about institutions putting in place proper agreements with Indigenous organisations. Do you have examples of where you've seen best practice of that working really well? Do you mean legal agreements? I mean, can you expand upon that? Because sometimes legalities in different jurisdictions can have entirely different meanings to different communities.
I don't think I can give you a really comprehensive answer. And one that I only have a tiny bit of familiarity with is the Mana to Mana agreement that University of Otago, which is my employer, has just signed with Ngāi Tahu in New Zealand, who are mana whenua of the lands on which the university sits. And I don't know the details of that document, but that document sets out the obligations of the university to Ngāi Tahu and specifies what that arrangement is. Now, I think a lot of other that can form or considered as an umbrella agreement, which other more specific agreements can sit underneath. And so I think the key thing there is that agreement, because the institution is a legal entity, then you can start thinking about contractual agreements and legal obligations. Whereas if you're working at the researcher level, that's a lot more difficult because then there's no real comeback if a researcher does something wrong except to go and complain to their institution who hasn't necessarily signed a legal agreement. So it's thinking about formalising those relationships so that each party actually knows what the rights and expectations are. So it's I guess a bit more of a solid framework to work from.
Okay, you can continue later. Yes, ma'am, there's one hand. Last one, we need to close. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou, Kate Bardwell from University of Otago, same institution as Mick. So my question really was originally just for Becky, but for anyone on the panel. So you've all referred to the CARE principles and we're all really familiar with them, but you also talk about this huge skill we have in kind of data literacy and capability. Do you think it's time that the CARE principles start addressing those, because you can't really see how they are going to be addressed, but it is a significant issue, I think, for all of our institutions. So just interested in your comments.
I'll just jump in and say keep an eye out for the CARE data maturity model. I think there's a session on that later in International Data Week and forthcoming publication, which really helps you understand what the goals and indicators are as to how you might be going against those CARE principles. Been involved peripherally in workshopping events, not leading the work, so I can't speak to it any more than that.
Half a second.
Anyone? Thank you very much for your question. I think in terms of where we're at with the framework at the moment, one of the key aspects is that community engagement. And if you think about the CARE principles, it's about the collective benefit and the authority. And in all of the elements, it's about in respect to the community that you're working with. And so without having those partnerships and those collaborations and understanding how the community views data, what they want to learn about data in terms of how they're using it perhaps in their roles or in their day-to-day lives, you need to start with those partnerships first, and that's how you can start to see the CARE principles come out in what we're learning about data and in data literacy frameworks. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but I know I can see the time's up in the corner of my eye.
Yeah, you can discuss that later. Colleagues, thank you very much for your participation and some points to ponder on. I've not heard anything about AI and the impact here. So another research question for those who are professors and those who are intending to study or write other articles, let's focus on that, how AI is going to impact on what we discuss on today. Thank you very much to the lovely audience. and the presenters. I don't forget you and myself too. Thank you very much.